Welcome. This is Bill Donahue with Discerning Truth. Thanks for everybody that joined me, and those of you that are lurking, not willing to say hi, hello to all of you. So it's Friday, and on Fridays I typically do stuff that is associated with Christianity, but maybe not necessarily what do you call it, a book in the Bible or that kind of subject. So Mondays and Wednesdays I teach through the Bible. Right now I'm in Ezekiel, and then on Fridays I call it Freaky Fridays, where we might do anything from like this as a deeply theological subject to something like I did Dogman a few years ago. What's the story with like Saint Christopher having a dog head? Where did that idea come from? So that's my Fridays. Just a scheduling note, I'm leaving for the airport to go to Honolulu as soon as I get off the air. I'm not going to be back until Tuesday night, so I will not be streaming Monday. I will repeat that at the end of the stream, but if you're catching on right now, I will not be there. And I recorded with Amy Jo, and if that broadcast happens tomorrow, I'm not going to be in her chat. I will not be taking my computer. I got too much to do on Honolulu. So with that, I want to get into the question I posted. Okay, God's omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. He's omniscient, meaning all knowledge. He's sovereign, right? I mean, he's the ruler he's the Lord of Lords, King of Kings. He's the ruler of the universe, right? And all of that. So since that's true, if God predestined something, if he predestined us unto salvation before the beginning of the world, if he predestined that, does that equal predetermination? That I have no choice in the matter, whatever. And then when people speak of free will, what exactly do they mean? How free does your will need to be? Can I, is libertarian free will what we're talking about, or is it something else? Is there some other level of freedom of the will? How free does your will have to be free? Those are kind of the questions that I'm looking at today. And I want you to understand this. I hit this subject often because it comes up with a lot of different things. And I look at, all kinds of ways to look at the same issue, because this is a very common question. Maybe the most common question I always get have to do with this, right? In one way or another. And many Christians, including theologians, confuse the theological concept of predestination with the philosophical concept of predetermination. And in doing so, they completely remove the element of human choice in salvation. They make you like puppets in God's play. Okay? And there are theologians that hold that position, and they're good Christian theologians hold that position. Okay? But when you look at Scripture, the Bible clearly teaches both that God predestined us and that we have human responsibility for our choices, right? To have responsibility for your choices mandates that you have at least some level of freedom in the will, right? I mean, I have a freedom in the will that has limitations. I can choose to flap my arms and fly. Doesn't mean I'm going to be able to fly. Okay, I can only choose that things which are in my nature to choose, right? But we're talking about moral choices here. And if I'm going to be held morally accountable, it seems logical that I need to have some level of freedom in that choice to do that. And that's kind of where we're going today, and that's the aspect I want to deal with. So we got to distinguish between these two words that seem like synonyms to us: predestination and predetermination. Now, a lot of times predetermination is just shortened to as determination. You'll hear people talking about that's determinist or that's determination. And but Jesus tells us we got to choose to obey, right? The element of choice is all through the Bible, and that seems to imply a freedom, right? That you can choose to obey or choose not to obey. You can choose God or you cannot choose God. There's an element of freedom that's there. So predestination cannot eliminate human freedom, or there would be no human freedom. It would be an illusion. And so predestined does not necessarily mean inevitable or predetermined. It can't, logically can't. Although there are, like I said, there are Christians that hold what's called hard determinism, a very, I would call it hyper Calvinism, very, very strong determinist view. Okay? The predestined seems to me that it means the destination's been set in advance, right? It's not a guarantee that you're going to get there. Okay? I can get in my car and decide my destination is Chicago. Well, probably not here from Hawaii anymore. When I was in California, I could get in my car, think of my destination is Chicago, and I could take off in that direction. But I changed my mind along the way and decided I'm not going to go to Chicago. I'm going to go somewhere else. Or I might get diverted on the way. And so a person on their way to heaven could get distracted by the allure of sin and not make it there, right? Just because your destination is predestined doesn't mean the choices you make along the way are predetermined. So among people that hold a more Calvinist view of this thing, and Calvinism's not monolithic. I want you to understand this. You have hard determinists like A.W. Pink, and he's on the kind of strict determinist level of Calvinism, right? You also have Calvinists who consider themselves compatibilists. Now, compatibilism, sometimes called soft determinism, is a position that causal determination is true, that God does cause it to happen, but that we still act as free, moral agents, responsible agents within there. Extant, in the absence of any external constraints, our actions are caused by our desires themselves, not by God forcing it. We don't act this way because God determined us that we're going to act this way. The list of Calvinists who are compatibilists is very long. Now, I'm going to argue that both John Calvin and Jonathan Edwards, and possibly, depends on how we define free will, I could throw Luther in there, okay? But they're a different kind of compatibilists than what we see today. A lot of compatibilists today are using a definition of free will that is called libertarian free will. That there's absolutely no restrictions on what you can choose, that you're 100% free to choose. And I will tell you, none of those men would accept that definition. So when you look at critics of compatibilism, including many Christian philosophers, Richard Swinburne from Oxford, Peter Van Wagner, and William Hasker, Jerry Walls, other philosophers, they claim that compatibilism only works if you define free will into an illusion. Because in their opinion, anything other than libertarian free will is not free will. Okay? So this is why these definitions get to be a little loose and harder to put your finger on. Now, somebody that I like and respect a lot right now is William Lane Craig, right? And he says that honest compatibilists must admit they can't reconcile God's omniscient providence and predestination with human free will. So we must accept that it remains a paradox. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, William Lane Craig is using a definition of free will that means libertarian free will. You have absolutely no restrictions on you. And if I accept that definition, I guarantee you I got to accept it as a paradox. But even if I don't accept it as a paradox, and I don't accept his definition of free will, and I use more of a Calvin and John Edwards and a different definition of free will that's not as blanket as what William Lane Craig uses, I'm still okay with it remaining a paradox that I can't resolve, right? I don't see the necessity or any biblical basis for the belief in libertarian free will. this is where we're going to have a problem. This is where I'm going to disagree with William Lane Craig and all these other philosophers, Alvin Plantinga. There's a whole long list of them that argue that libertarian free will exists. I'm going to argue it's not biblically, it doesn't, nor does it need to exist for you to have sufficient freedom of the will for you to be responsible for what you do, right? So you take, if you, probably the greatest living Christian philosopher right now, I would say, is Alvin Plantinga. Highly respected. I love his books. I love his thinking. They are not easy reads. If you're not used to reading philosophical material, Plantinga is not your starting point. Okay, he's not your entry-level philosopher. I think William Lane Craig does a better job of explaining Plantinga than sometimes Plantinga does, right? You know, but Alvin Plantinga has made some good arguments. His argument about God's not the author of evil because man had free will and we freely chose evil. He's made a lot of great arguments for us. But both of them accept this definition of free will that it has to be libertarian free will or it's not free will. It's something other than free will if you do that. So both of them have abandoned. They both were previously held to a more Calvinistic view. Plantinga was avowedly Calvinist and shifted to a position called Molinism. Now, Molinism is named after a 16th century Spanish Jesuit Catholic theologian named Luis de Molina. And I'm going to look at Molinism a little later in this stream, right? But for now, I just want to point out that I think these men are brilliant. I highly recommend you listen to William Lane Craig and read Alvin Plantinga. On this issue, I think they're dead wrong. Okay? Because I think they're starting with a definition of free will that it cannot be biblically justified. Right? And I'm going to ask you, could not an omniscient, omnipotent, and sovereign God allow for some level of human freedom to remain despite his predestination of the world? Okay? And if you say no, I'm saying, who are we to tell God what he can and cannot do? Okay? I may not understand how God did that, but clearly that God could do that seems logical to me, right? And God sees the end from the beginning. I always use the analogy of a snow globe. Think of a snow globe, and that's the entire of creations inside that snow globe. Now put a timeline in the bottom of that snow globe that you can see looking in, that starts at creation and ends at, whatever, the destruction of the universe, or wherever you want it to end. God is outside of time and space. He's looking at the snow globe. He sees the end from the beginning. There's no temporality to him. From his perspective, what happened in the garden and what happens in Revelation can be seen at the same time. Right? So from his perspective, the end result is 100% predetermined, predestined. It's there. But if you're walking along that timeline inside that snow globe, you're making free will choices. You're making choices based on your own thing. And I think that's kind of the easiest way to see the closest thing that I can find to explain this dilemma. Now, I don't claim to fully know the mind of God, nor to be able to fully comprehend the thoughts and the ways of God. So I'll agree with William Lane Craig, who conclude that the paradox remains unresolved, right? I'll accept that criticism. But so what? Who are we to think that mere mortal creations, that God, we would be able to fully understand God and everything God does and how he does it? I'm telling you, if that's what you expect from God, your God's too small. Because what I see in Scripture is that we can't do that. We have no idea what God is and how he thinks, and that we don't have the ability to comprehend what he does. Right? And I'm going to put up, I haven't put up all the slides so far because I just wanted to get the point. But in Ecclesiastes 8:16 and 17, this is Solomon speaking. And he says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that men cannot find out the work that is done underneath the sun. Okay? However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he can't find out. This is Solomon, considered the wisest man to ever live, telling you cannot know everything about God. Not possible. You can be the wisest man in the world, spend your entire life searching, and you're not going to totally understand God. In Job 11:7-12, he says, can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than the heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes through and imprisons or summons the court, who can turn him back? For he knows worthless men when he sees iniquity. Will he not consider it? But a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born of a man. He says, you're going to get understanding when you can birth a donkey. I mean, this is basically God chewing out Job. Who are you to question me? Do you have the even possibility? Isaiah 55:8-9 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I mean, come on. Could God say it more clearly that we're not going to totally understand him? I love solving puzzles. I like getting to the answers. I would love it for God to resolve every apparent paradox for me in Scripture. Right? And if I found a proposed solution to this predestination, free will, and divine providence and free will issue, if I found a solution offered by anybody that both solve the problem and match Scripture, I would embrace it. But to reject an idea because it's hard to understand is to commit the logical fallacy called the appeal to incredulity. It's too hard to understand, therefore it can't be true. Right? I don't understand. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that space is curved. To me, space is nothing. And then physicists have determined it's curved. Well, how do you curve nothing? This makes no sense to me. Doesn't mean it's not true. All right? But whenever I discuss the subject, I'm astounded how few people have even read any of the major texts dealing with the question, but then they get out and speak on that subject. There are 3 major works on this question. Martin Luther wrote The Bondage of the Will as a response to a Dutch Catholic priest, Desiderius Erasmus, in his book on free will. Now, Desiderius actually, he defended that humans possess the ability to choose between good and evil, and thus we have control over our own salvation. Basically, Erasmus was arguing in favor of libertarian free will. And I keep using that word libertarian because not everybody using the word free will means the same thing. And Luther was refuting his arguments by showing that Scripture portrays the will of man as a slave to sin, dead, and in other terms that are clearly show that human beings are incapable of achieving salvation through their own free will choices, and that we are entirely dependent on God's grace for their salvation. On the other hand, Luther maintained that the will, whether it be God's or man's, does what it does, good or bad, under no compulsion, but just as it wants or pleases, as it's totally free. So Luther wasn't saying you don't have free will, right? Because he's saying you do what you want because it's totally free. God does what he wants because he's totally free. That's in the bondage of the will. But I'm going to read you another passage from the Bondage of the Will that makes it seem like Luther doesn't believe free will exists, because he's using free will in two different senses. He rejected the idea that we sin or reject salvation because God predestined us to sin and reject salvation. We have free will within the parameters of our natures and God's decrees. Right? Sorry, I'm a little slow on flipping slides. I'll be with you in just a second. But Luther's view of why men do what they do was mostly based on his concept of necessity. This is a philosophical term. You'll hear it a lot, right? And among the quotations from Luther's works that were condemned by the Pope in 1520 was the statement that free will is something that exists in name only. Here, Luther's talking about libertarian free will. He used free will in both passages, but he means very different things in these things, because in one he's saying it exists, and the other one he's saying it doesn't exist. It's only in your imagination. That's either Luther's lost his mind or he's using free will differently, right? And this is in his defense of a statement. And I give you the Latin, but it's an assertion of all articles published in December of 1520. Luther goes one step further. He does not only declare that free will to be a concept without factual reference, but he also insists that there is not anybody who is in the position to even think one's own will, either good or bad, as everything happens with absolute necessity. Okay? So here, he seems to be 100% determinist, that there is no such thing as free will, but I just showed you a quote where he said free will exists. You got to reconcile those. In the way you reconcile them, he's using free will very differently. He's talking about two different things. I wish Luther would have said libertarian free will or something, made a distinction between them. He doesn't. But you got to go back and use your own brain and go, why is he saying one thing out of one side of his mouth and the exact opposite out the other side of his mouth? Either Luther is being self-contradictory or he has two different meanings. So the entire argument seems to be defending the position that no level of freedom of the will exists, which would make Luther a hard determinist if that were true. But at other times, he seems to fit with those theologians that we would call compatibilist or soft determinist. And I'm saying the reason you get to those conclusions is you're not allowing Luther to use two different definitions. When I meet someone arguing for libertarian free will exists and that is biblical, all right? I'm going to take the position that Erasmus absolutely did argue for libertarian free will, which is what Luther's arguing against. And Martin Luther took his arguments systematically and destroyed them. So if you're going to tell me that you believe libertarian free will, one, exists, and two, it's biblical, then my question to you is, which argument of Luther or of Erasmus do you think withstood Luther's arguments? And almost inevitably, people will tell me, well, I never read that book. They haven't read the arguments. They don't know what he was arguing. They don't know the rebuttals, but they've picked a side. Okay? This is like the people that we criticize for being low information voters, or that they come up with an opinion, they even cast a vote, but they never bother to study the issue. Right? And I think Martin Luther did decimate the arguments of Erasmus, right? But at times, in doing so, he took such a hard stance against any level of free will that I think Luther kind of boxed himself into a logical corner with his arguments. Because if you follow his arguments and don't allow him to use two different definitions of free will, right? You're going to get to the conclusion that God created some men for the purpose of having them sin, reject salvation, and endure eternal torment. That God absolutely did that. And that he created other people for the purpose of saving them and let them live with them in eternity. And Calvin's going to cite these passages from Luther and was But Luther's unwilling to accept what's called double predestination, that God would predestine people to go to hell, that he created them for the purpose, to work his purposes, but their ultimate destination was hell, that was predetermined by God beforehand. Luther wouldn't accept that, but his arguments kind of lead you there unless you understand Luther is using two different definitions of free will. Luther taught single predestination. That God, if you're going to heaven, God elected you, and he elected people for himself. He's going to actively save them and outworking a history. God did not decree the rest of mankind would be absolutely lost or reprobate and go to eternal hell. So while affirming election, Luther rejected what's called reprobation. Reprobation's the flip side of that coin. If he chose some to election, he chose others not to be elect. That's to be reprobate. Luther believed that God refrained from electing some to him to salvation, but at the same time, God didn't actively decree their continuation in sin and ultimate suffering as the consequence. This seems to me like he's just trying to squirm his way out of from underneath the conclusions demanded by his own argument, right? I think Calvin is going to correctly look at the problems with Luther's argument and offer correction to him, offer a logical correction that Luther was unwilling to do. Okay? And his next major work by John Calvin is called The Bondage and Liberation of the Will. See, Luther had just the bondage of the will. Calvin's adding the liberation. And just as Luther wrote his book as a rebuttal to a Roman Catholic theologian named Erasmus, Calvin's book is a dialogue with another Roman Catholic Dutch theologian, Albert Pygius. The subject matter is still the same. What is the nature of the will of man? And if free will exists, is it libertarian free will? Now, I'm adding these distinctions here to help you understand the question. I put free will in yellow and libertarian free will in red. They're not the same. Now, Pygius, I always pronounce that, Pygius is, he wrote 10 books. And Calvin only responded to 6 of them because he had to do them in a matter of months. And so he never finished responding to the rest of them. And if you ask me if John Calvin believed libertarian free will exists or if it's biblical, I can confidently answer with a resounding no. He absolutely did not believe either one of those things to be true. But if I loosen the definition of free will to say that free will is not libertarian free will with unrestricted ability to choose between alternate possibilities, or a special ability to transcend our natures, our fallen natures specifically. All that's required for free will to exist is morally relevant and a responsible sense is for mankind to be able to freely choose to do what we want to do. Then Calvin would argue that man does have that level of free will. You see the difference? He's arguing that we're free to choose what we by nature will choose. Right? I'll deal with some problems with this argument later, but I just want you to understand this is the distinction. He's getting around the dilemma Luther has, and Calvin's totally willing to accept election and reprobation because he says, yeah, God predestined it, but you chose it. Calvin argued that we all agree that God is absolutely free. Yet God always chooses to do good because it's in his nature to do good. You're not going to tell me that you don't think God is free, but God doesn't sin, right? Could God choose to sin? No, it's not in his nature to sin. Likewise, in our fallen nature of mankind, causes none of us to seek after God. That's the scriptures say, right? And we freely choose that which we want, which is sin. Romans 3:10 and 12, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, no, not even one. That seems to be pretty exclusive. Paul's not saying that some of us do and some don't. None of us. We choose evil, right? But what may be unclear here so far, because I'm dealing with Catholic theologians, is you need to understand Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox have all rejected it as heresy, both Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. So I need to define these words for you to understand. Pelagianism teaches that humans are born morally neutral and that we have libertarian free will to choose between good and evil. They also believe that humans can achieve salvation through moral behavior and effort without God acting first. This without God acting first is going to be the sticking point here, I want you to understand, for Christians. Now, semi-Pelagianism tried to get a compromise between Pelagianism and what was considered orthodoxy. And it holds that humanity that we're tainted by sin, but not to the extent that we don't have libertarian free will to cooperate with God's grace on our own. Again, without God acting first. Semi-Pelagianism says we are sinful, but we can still recognize truth, cooperate with God's grace, and choose to seek Christ on our own. We need God's grace to be saved, but we can take the first step towards Christ by our own free will, our own libertarian free will, apart from grace, right? This is the point where Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholic Christians all reject both ideas. That this idea that we can act first, that we are still sufficiently free in our wills are sufficiently free that we can act without God acting first. That was rejected. And what was happening is you had Catholic theologians at the time, Luther and Calvin, who were regurgitating ideas from semi-Pelagianism. And they got taken to task by Calvin and Luther. And these regurgitation of semi-Pelagianism still exist in the church today. Okay? Now, most Protestants that aren't Lutheran or Calvinists in your views on salvation, on how salvation happens, hold to what's called Arminianism. Not that you're from Armenia, right? This is Jacob Arminius. And he rejected the idea of absolute predestination. Okay? And instead holds that God's sovereignty and human free will, libertarian free will, are compatible. Arminians believe that God's grace is available to all people, all humans ever born, and that individuals have the ability to accept or reject God's offer of salvation because of, what's going to be called prevenient grace. Now that's how Arminian is not considered a heresy, because they don't think we can act on our own. Now, some Calvinists will tell you Arminians are heretics, and some Lutherans may also. I'm just telling you, in general consensus among Christians, the positions of Calvinist soteriology or Arminian soteriology, how you get saved, are all considered underneath the tent of orthodoxy. But the Arminian solution to this is that, yeah, we're all fallen. None of us can come to God, but God extends his prevenient grace. Prevenient means first. He gives grace first to all mankind and frees your will up to give you back libertarian free will so that you can choose. And that's done by prevenient grace. And that's how they solve the dilemma. And that's why they're not subject to the same arguments that Luther and Calvin are making against Erasmus and Pelagius, right? But they're saying, Luther and Calvin are saying, you're just repackaging the errors of Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. These are heretical views of Erasmus and Pelagius. And their views of what happened to man at the fall in the garden are the same. Pelagianism clearly taught that man had a version of free will that we would call libertarian free will. And these men are creating the same error because they say we have libertarian free will. Calvin and Luther say, no, you don't. And Jacob Arminius say, yeah, you do, but it's only because of God's prevenient grace. These men are saying, under none of those circumstances, you have it because God gave it to you. Right? And so I want you to understand, they're promoting a view of free will that is absolute, that is rejected by every branch of Christianity. Right? But has been accepted by many Protestants. Including, I talked to you about, William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga and Molinism, which I'm going to get back to in a minute. They start with this definition of libertarian free will and say that it absolutely exists. They're making the same error as Pelagian. They're starting with that error. It's not biblical. Right? Now, both Luther and Calvin denied that libertarian free will existed. Luther didn't lay out any other version of free will. In fact, you have to read it into his writing. You got to go, he can't have meant libertarian free will by this use of free will, which is what I told you. He had to have a different definition or he's self-contradictory. Right? But I think if you read Luther, had Calvin written first, I think Luther would have agreed with Calvin's definition of what free will is. And that's that we are free to choose that which is by our nature to choose. Right? Free will is not merely an illusion. It is you are free to choose what is in your nature, right? And the arguments against this is if all stores only sold blue shirts and you went in and you chose to buy a blue shirt, was that really a free will choice, right? And that's what they're saying is if you are but sin nature is only going to choose sin, and then you sin, are you really freely choosing to sin? And this is the argument against this idea, right? And that's why they're arguing that it's just an illusion, and it's not really freedom in any sense of the word. So this is the state of the argument back then, and then along comes another Catholic theologian named Luis de Molina, and he asserted that libertarian free will did exist. Another one. Notice it. I want you Protestants, all Protestants listening to me. This idea keeps coming out of Catholic theologians. That ought to give you a pause. Catholic theologians that the Catholic Church rejected their ideas is not being true. Okay? But these are Catholic theologians being argued with by Protestants. And then I got Protestants buying into these ideas and not understanding they're taking on ideas that were brought up by Catholic theologians. Step back for just a minute. And these are not just average Catholic theologians, they're Catholic theologians on the extreme position within their church. Right? So Molina's idea, he posited that God doesn't just have two types of knowledge, that he has three types of knowledge. And this middle knowledge, sentia media, okay? It's just Latin term for middle knowledge, right? Is the understanding of counterfactuals. What's counterfactuals? It's things that could be true under certain circumstances but aren't necessarily true, right? And Molina says that that knowledge allows God to know how people would act in any given situation before he makes his decrees. So Molina's ideas are called Molinism. And the arguments made by Molina, they're very technical, but I'm going to try to simplify them here. And it's not going to seem simple when I start, so hang with me. Molina argued that we can reconcile divine foreknowledge with libertarian free will if we think God's knowledge is in the sense of three logical moments. These moments of knowledge are not to be thought of chronologically. Rather, they are to be understood logically. Okay? So something can happen at the exact same time chronologically, but they're logically anterior or posterior to one another. And I know this is going to sound like a word salad, but just don't give up on me yet. I'm gonna try to get you to the bottom and explain to you why I don't think this word salad even gets us where we want to be. Molinists differentiate between these different moments of knowledge, which are respectively called natural knowledge, middle knowledge, and free knowledge. So I need to define these terms for you so you understand their argument, right? Natural knowledge is God's knowledge of all necessary and possible truths, all things which can be in this moment, logical moment. God knows every possible combination of causes and effects. He also knows all truth and logic and moral truths. He knows everything. But this middle knowledge is God's knowledge of what free creatures would do in any given circumstance, like a master chess player almost, right? This knowledge consists of what philosophers call counterfactuals, or creaturely freedom. These are facts about which any creature with a free will would freely do in any circumstance in which it could be placed. That's what I'm saying. It's like this knowledge is like being such a master chess player that when you make your move, you know exactly the move the other player is going to make. Okay? But God does that for everybody on the planet. And that's what their idea is, that's how his middle knowledge works. And then I'm going to insert a placeholder here for God's creative command. I'm going to discuss it later, but it logically has to fit in here, and this is going to be a problem for them. Free knowledge is God's knowledge of what he decides to create, all things that are actually are. So it's not just, that's knowledge when it moves from the possible to the actual. God's free knowledge is his knowledge of the world as it actually exists. And they separate God's knowledge into those three different things, where most philosophers only have two. God's natural knowledge, his free knowledge. And everything fits into those two categories, and you don't need a middle knowledge, right? So as you saw in the previous slide, I inserted a placeholder in the logical order for God's creative command, because this is where things are going to get slippery for a Molinist. Imagine God contemplating all possible worlds that he could create. He thinks of, in his mind, he's imagining, I want to create a world, I want to get to this outcome. In some of those worlds, libertarian free will would not exist. In some of them, it would exist, right? In some worlds, sin wouldn't exist. In other worlds, it would exist. But after considering all the possible worlds that God could create, he decides world X best serves his purposes for his ultimate goal. So let's just say, if in world X, God sees that I would make libertarian free will choices needed to become saved, and he creates world X, then I'm in like Flint. I'm going to be saved. But if God chooses world X, a world that I would make free will choices that will lead to damnation, then I'm doomed and I can't do anything about it. Under that scheme, that's going to be more deterministic than the hardest Calvinist you're ever going to get. Okay? Molinism at this point is strict determinism. And they're going to find a way out of this. Okay? And I'm going to show you how they think they get out from underneath that. And they're going to play games with God's foreknowledge. What it means for God to foreknow. They're going to redefine words and play fast and loose with definitions. If you ask a Molinist, what is God's foreknowledge if I choose salvation? They're going to answer you that God's knowledge would be that I'd choose salvation. But what if I choose the path of damnation? Then according to a Molinist, God's foreknowledge would be that I would choose the path of damnation. That makes God's foreknowledge contingent upon the future actions of his creations. God is not a contingent being. He's a necessary being. God's knowledge is not contingent upon my choice. This is a theological problem with Molinism. One of their same problem exists in open theism. Instead of thinking of God's foreknowledge as being Bill will accept salvation or Bill will reject the gospel, they claim that God's foreknowledge is open So his foreknowledge is only Bill might or might not accept salvation. That guts the doctrine of omniscience and foreknowledge. Absolutely guts it. It relegates God to a being whose future is just as contingent as ours. This is a huge theological problem that I don't see anybody, and I don't have contact with Dr. Craig anymore. When I did, I should have asked him this question, and I was negligent in not doing it. But while Molinists deny that they're embracing the same error as open theism, none of their explanations I've ever seen from them or heard from them demonstrate that they don't. They say they don't, but when they try to explain to you why they're different, I said it's exactly the same. They use an analogy of a thermometer. The thermometer tells you the temperature, it doesn't cause the temperature. How's that any different? The thermometer is not omniscient, is it? So you're making God like a thermometer. I'm seeing problems here, theological problems, right? Like I said, I know very brilliant men that I highly respect that have very competent minds who embrace Molinism. But to me, it starts with the unbiblical proposition that libertarian free will exists. And like I said, if you're going to tell me libertarian free will exists, I want you to go back to wherein Luther, Calvin, and Jonathan Edwards destroyed it, all the arguments for its existence, and tell me which arguments they didn't sufficiently destroy. Because I don't see it. It's not biblical. Right? And then they sacrifice divine foreknowledge and his omniscience on the altar of this libertarian free will that they created out of nothing, because it's not from the Bible. Now, I'm already running a little long. I haven't gone over, but I know I'm running long in this study. But the third great work on this question on free will, which I would recommend to anybody, Jonathan Edwards is a brilliant writer. It's called Freedom of the Will. And based on the title Jonathan Edwards chose, you might think he's defending free will. You'd be wrong, okay? After a fairly brief introduction to the issue, Edwards defines philosophical concepts in terms like necessity and contingency and ability. This is why I recommend his book, because he defines the terms for you. Okay? He's going to use those terms incessantly throughout his book. But there's a section in the book where that's going to be his main focus, these three issues. And I'm just saying this, if you think Molinism's an acceptable choice or libertarian free will exists, I'd say read that section of the book twice. Pay attention, because I think Edwards absolutely destroys it, right? He makes a distinction between what he calls moral ability and natural ability, or inability in this case, right? In either one. So what man's physically or morally capable of doing. Man's physically able to walk, but he cannot fly. Moral ability or inability has to do with what a person can or cannot choose of their own volition. A wife of noble character simply cannot cheat on her husband because it's part of her nature to be faithful. No amount of temptation is going to change that person, that woman. A faithful woman or a faithful man that is by nature faithful is not going to cheat. It's in their nature to be faithful. It is in God's nature to be good. He chooses to be good because it's in his nature. And he's saying human beings, as responsible moral agents, always and without exception, choose to do what we most strongly inclined to do at the time. In fact, it's impossible for us to not do what we're most inclined to do, disposed to do. And in this way, he's going to argue throughout the book that our volition, our will, is determined by our nature. But lest we think that Edwards was just a mere fatalist, one of these that we're just puppets in God's play, he's also going to argue that because this choosing according to our own strongest inclination is also completely consistent with moral liberty, that we're morally at liberty to choose others, but we don't, because we choose what we want. We choose what we desire, right? If you're struggling with alcohol or drugs or whatever, you're choosing that because right now that's your strongest desire. You may at a later date choose a different solution in your life. You may, whatever you're struggling with, you make that choice because it's your strongest desire. When your strongest desire is to serve God, that's the choice you make. So we have freedom. Now, God writes a lot about God's foreknowledge and employs a flurry of scriptural citations to prove that God's foreknowledge is certain. The open theist and Molinist would be well served to pay attention here, because their arguments, Edwards, before these ideas were even out here in the discussion in philosophy, open theism even existed, Edwards destroyed them. Then he argues that all human choice, which happened in time and space, right? They're already known by God, which Calvinists and Arminians also admit that God knows all those choices. But if they're known to God beforehand, they are also as sure to come to pass in the future, just as God's foreknowledge saw them from his perspective before the beginning. I'll fix that for you in the notes. If you're new here, I catch my spelling errors on the fly, usually while I'm streaming. With God, there's no difference between seeing a future event and a past one. That's why I used that snow globe analogy earlier. If God sees and looking from outside of time, looks inside of time, and he sees the choices you're going to make, they're as certain to come to pass as anything. But on that timeline, you and I are making free will choices within our abilities, right? I can't choose to fly. I can't choose to anything other than what my nature is going to allow me to choose. It's only by God's grace that I chose him, right? Whether you think it's prevenient grace or effective grace, somewhere God's grace allowed me to choose him, right? Edwards answers the criticism of why would it be praiseworthy to do what's right or worthy, or condemnation to do evil? You know, why would you praise somebody to do good if it's their nature to do good, right? If it's a wife's nature to be faithful to her husband, why is that praiseworthy? If it's your nature to be a degenerate, whatever person, why would that be reasons for condemnation? If that's the deposition of their neighbor driving us to make those choices. And he rebuts that by replying that one's disposition is exactly what makes that person's action worthy of praise or blame in the first place. Suppose the Good Samaritan helped the poor mangled traveler in Luke 10 from a completely neutral heart. That's what we're calling untainted by the fall, right? Just a neutral heart. He's perfectly has absolute libertarian free will. He felt nothing in his heart either way about the helpless man's condition. He flips a coin, and if it's heads, he'll help him, and if it's tails, he'll leave him. Would this be more praiseworthy than if his disposition cared deeply to seeing that man, and he felt the plight of that man, and he took care of him? Of course not. His concerned disposition is exactly what prompts him to help, and the reason why his action is worthy of praise, not condemnation. Well, I don't know. It's worthy of praise. I'm not going to condemn him for helping a Good Samaritan. Well, that was a big typo. We'll fix that on the PDF. Okay. So Edwards continues, the God himself is completely and absolutely deposed to holy action and cannot do otherwise. Yet he is the most praiseworthy being in the universe. Surely we don't find fault in God for acting righteously, from his nature, which includes a determined, necessary inclination to do what's good, would we? I mean, that would be stupid to say that God's not praiseworthy because it's in his nature to do good, right? So it's stupid to argue that just because we're fallen man that we're not praiseworthy if we choose to do good, or we're not worthy of condemnation if we choose to do evil. The argument makes no sense, and Edwards does a great job of showing it. In the final section of his book, Edward addresses a host of objections against his position that were still made in his day. This argument's been going on through all time in Christianity, and maybe before that, right? For instance, one of the objections is, doesn't moral necessity, that you're going to do what you're inclined to do, make human beings just mere puppets in God's play, like or machines, moral machines? Isn't his position just another restatement of the old Greek concept of fate? Doesn't this make God the author of sin by creating us with sinful dispositions, making God the author of evil also? And just as I did with the arguments made by Luther and Calvin, I ask again, people that claim libertarian free will exists, which of these objections do they believe Edwards was unsuccessful in rebutting? And rarely has anyone making those arguments ever read Luther, Calvin, or Edwards on this subject. But they're still sure they're correct, right? You're certain of your concepts in advanced math, but you never read a math book in your life. You never took a math class, right? But you're certain of it. People do this. They come out and they make these pronouncements without ever reading the people that thought deeply on this subject. And I'm not saying you have to, but if you're going to start taking theological positions that are controversial, you ought to at least read both sides of the issue, right? But I want to be clear here. There are Christians who hold positions held by Luther, Calvin, Edwards, Arminius, and Molina. Even Christians who hold to open theism and process theology, which I think are seriously in error, they're not excluded from the grace of the gospel. This is not a question essential to salvation, right? This is a theological question, a little further out in the circle, right? In my streams, we take a look at hard issues, hard questions, right? Some of these issues are hard to wrap our minds around. And I don't expect my listeners to always agree with me. Some of you may be disagreeing with the arguments I've made so far, and that's perfectly fine. If you always agreed with everything I said, I would know one of us wasn't thinking. But for some of you, this is going to be an introduction to ideas that you've never heard discussed in church, and that's my frustration. For others, I hope it's given you a deeper understanding of the questions so that you can think about it and come up to the answers that you think best are correct, which ones you think are more logical, right? And if you want to dig into this issue deeper, then read the major texts on the subjects before discussing the issues, right? Luther thought his work on free will was the only thing he wrote that was worth reading. Okay. I mean, that's a pretty self-deprecating review, right? I think Calvin did a good job of correcting Luther, but both of them end up with problematic positions, in my opinion. But it doesn't mean that they were 100% right or 100% wrong. These men are struggling with an issue. But if you come back to the fact, God, I don't know everything about how you're doing or what you're doing. I don't totally understand the mind of God, nor do I think I should be able to, right? That a finite being living in a fallen world should be able to comprehend an infinite and omniscient and omnipotent God, that we're going to be able to do it. If you understand that, then it's okay to embrace the mystery. There's one thing I think the Eastern Church does better than the Western Church, is they embrace the mysteries. sometimes a little too far, okay, but they embrace the mysteries. They embrace the mysteries in the sacraments, right? They embrace the mysteries in this issue. And they're perfectly comfortable with the idea that they're not going to totally understand God. And I think if we can do it, our rational minds in the Western world want to get rid of all the mysteries. We want to have all the answers. That's our natures. That's the nature of our culture. And I'm saying, step back and think, really, do we ever think we're going to totally understand God? So with that, I'm going to put a video on. I'll try to read the chat. I don't know if this will prompt questions or I'm going to have people's eyes rolled back in their head, but whichever one works out. And I'll be back here in a minute, and we'll talk again, and I'll go over my schedule one more time.
Behold, bless ye the Lord, all ye servants of the Lord Most High, which by day and night, standing in the light, in the temple of the Lord, I fall down on my knees. I will bless the Lord. I lift my hands to you. You will never leave. You are always standing by my side. Yeah. When men cast their eyes and when troubles rise, you are always there. Yeah. I fall down on my knees. I will bless the Lord. I lift my hands to you. You are all I ever need. Jesus, you have set me free. I will worship you alone. You will come to take me home. You are all I ever need. Jesus, you have set me free. I will worship you alone. You will come to take me home. You are all I ever need. Jesus, you have set me free. I will worship you alone. You will come to take me home. I fall down on my knees. I will bless the Lord. I lift my hands to Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Fall down on my knees. I will bless the Lord.
Okay. So I'm back. I didn't see any necessarily questions out there to answer. I kind of thought this was going to be a lot hit you in the face. Uh, but I did like, you know, Singing Pretty put up the sticker about the Bible's our fact checker, and I think that's correct. That's really where we got to go. We got to check all our facts. All our theology has to be checked with the Bible. That's got to be the basis of this. But you also need to understand when having conversations with other Christians and we're discussing these things, not everybody's using the same definitions of the words. And if you're going to have a rational conversation, you got to get same definitions. And when people speak of free will, they're not all saying the same thing. They don't all mean the same thing. When people talk about inerrancy of Scripture, they're not meaning the same thing by inerrancy, right? There's 5 major views on inerrancy. Well, wait a minute. I thought that was self-explanatory what that meant. No, it's not. There's major differences on how they understand that. There are major differences on how you understand these issues. And we fight with each other, you know. We get in end times fights about stuff, you know, and this drives me crazy with people that they'll fight about this. You know, I mean, I'm a premillennialist, generally speaking. I mean, that's where I land. Premillennialism is one of 4 major views on the end times. And inside premillennialism, it divides into about 4 other views, right? You know, so what am I in? 1/16 of, you know, I mean, if there's 4 views in each spot, I'm in a position that, you know, in a group of 100 Christians, there's probably going to be 16 different positions being represented on how the end times work out. We're all Christians. We're all believers. We're all believing that Jesus is coming back to judge the living and the dead. We have different understandings of how that's going to work out. We got to be able to tolerate each other. If you're a Calvinist, I don't want to see your post about how Arminians are going to hell. If you're Arminius, I don't want to see how that Calvinism came out of a pit of hell. Okay? These are people struggling with the same questions about the Bible, and they're trying to focus on different ways, and they're looking at it. But if we want to have a rational conversation among our in-house, among Christians, we got to use the same definitions of words. And to look at, otherwise we talk past each other. Just like I told you on salvation. Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants talk past each other because we define salvation differently. Whoa, what do you mean? We all accept that election, right? The call, justification, sanctification, and glorification are part of salvation. We all accept that. But Protestants also use the word salvation to describe it, that moment of justification, where we accepted Christ, right? Catholics and Orthodox do not. They see salvation as one continuous path, unbroken line, not distinctive steps along the way. We all agree that good works are part of sanctification. But because we say salvation is equal to justification, that we use that synonymous, we use that word synonymous with that, we would say good works are subsequent to salvation, that they're there. Whereas the Catholic and Orthodox sees it as part of the salvation process. Not that they earn your salvation, but it's part of it. And we talk past each other because we're using different definitions of the words. We're saying the same words, we mean different things by them. And that happens a lot in Christianity. And that's why I take time to define some of these theological terms for you. Take you into looking at stuff like open theism and process theology and Molinism that a lot of you are never going to hear of. Or look at the arguments, you know, made by some of these theologians. And I made a big deal out of the fact that they were Catholic. Catholics taught us a lot of good things too. I mean, a lot of good things came out of, you know, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and different people who were Catholic theologians. But I know a lot of Protestants that think anything Catholic is bad. I'm saying, well, you're embracing stuff that was thought up by Catholic theologians. You ought to, you know, if that's your position and you want to be consistent, you got to reject it all. I don't reject it all because I chew up the meat and spit out the bones. And that's what I'm trying to encourage everybody that listens to me to do. Okay. So what I did was I moved my introduction to the end, towards the end, because it was taking up too much time in the beginning. I'm going to do this. So I need to remind you, there is no stream Monday. I normally broadcast Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm heading to the airport to go to Honolulu as soon as I get off the stream today. And I'm going to be there until Tuesday night. So I will not be streaming Monday. I should be back for Wednesday. If Neil gets back on Tuesday, I will not be available to join her. So even if she streams next week, you will not see me on Neil's stream on Tuesday. But I broadcast Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Donahue Papa on most platforms, Bill Donahue on Pilled, and Discerning Truths on YouTube. But by far, Donahue Papa is the name I use most places, and I would have used it everywhere if I could have, but, things happen. If you think of a question or I didn't get your question, you want to ask me on a different subject, just send me an email, bill@discerningtruths. I am, a lot of my Freaky Friday broadcasts come out of questions that came in the email, and I just develop on them. You're going to see after the stream, I try to catch I proofread everything I do. And then I will have glaring typos or even incorrect words when I go live that I don't spot till I'm live. So I will post a corrected PDF of all my notes on Discerning Truths Group on Telegram. You can download it. It'll have any of the Bible passages, all the references. It's going to be up there. You can take your time and read it if you want to. I've recently, in the last month or so, started writing on Substack. These are articles that don't take on a 1 hour stream to cover. And then I have a little more freedom on Substack. I wrote a little bit over there on cryptocurrencies. In fact, Amy and I discussed, Amy Joe, a little bit about how I see the digital economy. And even though I'm involved in it, and I think you're all involved in it, whether you know it or not, are involved in it, I see a connection between that and the economy that the Antichrist is going to use. And should a Christian avoid it or not? Or can you get involved in this? So we talked a little bit about that with Amy Jo, and I wrote up some issues with this stuff because I'm telling you, there's some differences with this digital economy that are a little scary, and absolutely lead to the potential of total power over your ability to buy and sell that are coming, like it or not, they are coming, and it's just there. And then, like I said, I'm not a big fan of YouTube, but I do love their playlist. When I went on YouTube and I discovered their playlist, it was a great way to organize my videos. And then when I went on Rumble, one of my complaints was they didn't have playlists, at least not for this use. But they do allow you to create channels underneath your account. In fact, they want you to broadcast on the channel or they won't promote your account. So I created like 13 channels over there to organize my stuff. I have more playlists on YouTube than I have channels on Rumble, but it just helps me organize the stuff. Like on YouTube, Ezekiel has its own playlist. On Rumble, Ezekiel's in a playlist called Old Testament Books, and their studies on all the Old Testament books are together. But they're there, and it's always just good, and replays are forever. And Michael's back from the inauguration in California, so he was broadcasting this morning. He'll be back tomorrow. I'm really glad that he had a chance to go back there and be part of the experience, the inauguration. He sure worked hard for that. And he broadcasts 6 days a week, 5:30 a.m. On Sundays, his wife Linda joins him. They're going through Psalms, and right now Michael's going back to 1st, 2nd Samuel. I think he's going to do them both. He's in 1 Samuel right now. But I highly suggest. Michael's great way to start your day. Does a little worship and praise. Proverb of the day based on the day of the month. 31 Proverbs. So, if it's day 24 today, it was Proverbs 24. Right? That's what he does. And then he does a short Bible study. Well worth your time to check him out. But with that, I'm going to get out of here for today. And thank you all for joining. And thank you for the well-wishing for the travels. I just got to go over there and work on a condo for a few days, and then I'll be back. And God willing, we'll be back into Ezekiel on Wednesday, but don't expect to see me between now and then. Thank you.
From another guy.